Trade. It's one of humanity's oldest instincts, the exchange of one thing for another. But today, it's no longer just a transaction between two people or two towns. It's the invisible bloodstream of the global economy, linking continents, shaping nations, and silently influencing every aspect of modern life. From the phone in your hand to the food on your table, almost everything you touch has crossed borders, often multiple times before reaching you. Yet for something so fundamental, few truly understand how global trade actually works, or the immense power structures that govern it. On the surface, trade looks simple. Countries buy and sell goods to one another. But behind the simplicity lies a vast, interconnected system, a chessboard of nations, corporations, currencies, and resources, where every move can shift the balance of global power. Trade isn't just about goods and services, it's about strategy. It's about control over resources, access to markets, and influence over global supply chains. It's about who sets the rules and who must follow them. Every trade agreement, tariff, and shipping route represents not just economic cooperation, but geopolitical negotiation. It's where money meets power, and where economics merges with diplomacy. The global economy is no longer defined by borders on a map. It's a network, intricate, fragile, and constantly shifting. Oil from the Middle East fuels factories in China. Microchips designed in California are assembled in Taiwan. Wheat from Ukraine feeds Africa. A single disruption, a conflict, a pandemic, a blocked canal can send shockwaves through the entire system. Trade is both the great unifier and the great divider. It has lifted millions out of poverty, but it has also created new dependencies, inequalities, and vulnerabilities. Beneath the promises of globalization lie the quiet realities of power. Who produces, who consumes, and who profits? But how did we get here? How did trade evolve from simple exchanges in ancient markets to the trillion-dollar global network that defines modern civilization? And why does it matter who controls what? To understand the geopolitics of trade, we must go back, far back, to when the first merchants crossed deserts, oceans, and empires, setting in motion a process that would forever change the fate of nations. Because trade has never been just about goods. It has always been about ambition, survival, and dominance. Today, we peel back the layers of this vast system to uncover not just how trade works, but how it shapes the world we live in. This is the hidden story of borders, markets, and power. This is the story of global trade. The origins of trade and the birth of global networks. Long before trade agreements and shipping containers, there were caravans crossing deserts, ships sailing into unknown waters, and merchants risking everything for spices, silk, and salt. The story of global trade begins not in modern ports, but in the dust of ancient civilizations. In Mesopotamia, over 4,000 years ago, trade was already a sophisticated operation. Merchants exchanged grain for metals, livestock for textiles. Clay tablets recorded every transaction, marking the first written contracts in human history. But trade was more than survival. It was the foundation of civilization itself. Cities rose where goods met. Crossroads of commerce became centers of power. The Silk Road, stretching from China to the Mediterranean, became humanity's first global trade network. It was not a single road, but a vast web of routes connecting empires, cultures, and religions. Silk, spices, and precious stones flowed west. Gold, glass, and art traveled east. But what traveled alongside goods was even more powerful: ideas. Mathematics, philosophy, and technology spread through the same channels as silk and silver. Trade became the engine of cultural evolution. Centuries later, the seas replaced the sands. The age of exploration redefined global trade forever. Portuguese ships sailed around Africa in search of spices. Spanish galleons crossed the Atlantic in pursuit of gold. The world was suddenly connected by water and by empire. Trade became conquest by another name. Nations built fleets not just to transport goods, but to control them. Whoever commanded the trade routes controlled the world. The rise of maritime empires marked the first era of geo-economic power. The Dutch East India Company, founded in 1602, was not just a trading business, it was a state within a state. It could wage war, colonize lands, and print money. Its success revealed a new truth: commerce could build empires faster than armies. From that moment on, global trade became inseparable from geopolitics. Colonies were established not for land, but for resources: sugar, cotton, tea, and minerals, the raw materials that fueled Europe's growing industries. The triangular trade between Europe, Africa, and the Americas formed the dark heart of this system. Goods, slaves, and raw materials exchanged in a brutal cycle of profit and exploitation. Trade shaped borders, created wealth, and carved inequalities that still echo today. But with every era of expansion came an era of resistance. Local economies were dismantled, cultures displaced, and entire regions made dependent on the global marketplace. Trade was no longer just about exchange, it was about dominance. The power to dictate who could buy, who could sell, and on what terms became the essence of imperial control. Then came the Industrial Revolution, the great accelerator of globalization. Machines multiplied production, factories demanded raw materials, and markets expanded beyond imagination. Steamships replaced sailing vessels, railroads connected interiors to ports, and telegraphs shrank time itself. For the first time, the world began to move in sync, economically, if not politically.
Technology has become both the backbone and the brain of this system. Artificial intelligence optimizes shipping routes, predicts demand, and manages inventories. Satellites track cargo with pinpoint accuracy. Blockchain and digital currencies promise transparency and speed in global transactions. In essence, trade is no longer just physical. It is digital, algorithmic, and instantaneous. Yet, this unprecedented efficiency comes with new vulnerabilities. Dependence on a few critical nodes, like semiconductor fabrication plants or shipping hubs, gives certain nations and corporations immense leverage. A disruption in one place can cascade worldwide, revealing the fragility beneath the system's apparent strength. The tools that enable prosperity are the same tools that create risk. Climate change adds another layer of complexity. Rising sea levels, extreme weather events, and shifting agricultural zones threaten supply chains and resources. Nations must now navigate a future where trade is shaped not only by policy and power, but by environmental forces beyond their control. The geopolitics of trade has expanded to include not just money and markets, but survival itself. Amid these challenges, opportunities also emerge. Countries that invest in resilient infrastructure, green technologies, and diversified supply chains can gain strategic advantage. Collaboration across borders, in research, logistics, and policy, becomes as critical as competition. Trade is no longer a zero-sum game. It is a dynamic equilibrium, balancing risk, innovation, and influence. Ultimately, global trade is more than the sum of transactions, agreements, or tariffs. It is a mirror of human ambition, ingenuity, and conflict. It tells the story of empires that rose on spice and silk, of corporations that thrived on oil and technology, and of nations that navigated vulnerability and opportunity alike. It is a story of power measured not in weapons, but in ships, pipelines, ports, and networks. The future of trade will demand foresight, adaptability, and strategic vision. Nations and corporations alike must understand that every shipment, every agreement, and every investment carries consequences that ripple across continents and generations. Success will favor those who can anticipate disruption, manage interdependence, and navigate the complex interplay of politics, technology, and resources. And so, trade remains what it has always been, a reflection of humanity itself. It is ambition and cooperation, opportunity and risk, power and vulnerability. It is the invisible architecture shaping nations and shaping lives, silently connecting billions of people across time and space. As we move forward into an era defined by technology, climate change, and geopolitical rivalry, understanding trade is not optional, it is essential. Beyond borders, beyond tariffs, beyond currency, global trade is the story of who we are, how we interact, and what kind of world we will create. Because in the end, the flow of goods is more than commerce. It is the flow of influence, the pulse of civilizations, and the quiet hand that shapes history. The world is connected, fragile, and full of possibility. And those who grasp the hidden forces of trade will understand not just the economy, but the future itself.
Trade had evolved from a series of local interactions into a planetary system. But as it grew, so did competition. Every empire sought new markets, new colonies, and new resources to feed its industries, and when trade routes collided, conflicts followed. World wars, at their core, were not only about ideology or territory, they were also about access to resources and control over trade. Oil fields, rubber plantations, and shipping lanes became strategic prizes. The modern world learned that controlling trade meant controlling destiny. By the mid-20th century, the world stood at a crossroads. Empires had collapsed, but global trade had survived, reborn in a new form. A new order was emerging, one where economic alliances would replace empires and trade agreements would replace colonies. But beneath the promises of cooperation, the same power struggle continued, just wearing a new face. The question was no longer who could conquer land, but who could control the flow of goods, capital, and technology. The post-war order and the birth of the modern trade system. When World War II ended, the world was shattered, economies ruined, empires dissolved, and trade networks in chaos. But out of the ruins came an idea that global stability could be rebuilt not just through peace treaties, but through trade. The victors of the war understood something profound, that commerce could do what armies could not, bind nations together through mutual dependence. In 1944, at a quiet mountain resort in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, representatives from 44 nations gathered to design a new global economic order. The result was revolutionary. They created the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank, institutions meant to stabilize currencies, rebuild war-torn economies, and promote international cooperation. But beneath the idealism lay a deeper ambition, to ensure that trade flowed freely under a system dominated by the West, particularly the United States. America emerged from the war not just as a military superpower, but as an economic one. It held most of the world's gold reserves, its factories were intact, and its currency, the US dollar, became the foundation of the new monetary system. Under Bretton Woods, the dollar was pegged to gold, and other currencies were pegged to the dollar. This made the U.S. not just a participant in global trade, but its anchor. With stability came expansion. The post-war decades saw an unprecedented boom in global commerce. Factories in Europe and Japan roared back to life. Container ships revolutionized logistics, shrinking oceans into corridors of efficiency. New institutions like the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, laid the groundwork for today's World Trade Organization, WTO, standardizing trade rules and reducing barriers between nations. But this new order was not without hierarchy. The free market was never truly free. It was structured. The United States set the rules, multinational corporations enforced them, and developing nations supplied the raw materials and labor. It was a system that promised prosperity, but often delivered dependency. As the Cold War intensified, trade became another battlefield. The capitalist West and the communist East built parallel economies, each with its own alliances and dependencies. The U.S. wielded trade as a weapon, using sanctions, embargoes, and aid packages to influence political outcomes. The Soviet Union countered with its own networks through Comecon, trading within the socialist bloc. Global commerce had become a geopolitical chessboard. Yet even as the world divided ideologically, it remained united economically by one simple truth. No nation could thrive in isolation. Energy, food, and technology crossed borders faster than ideologies could. And as decolonization swept across Asia and Africa, newly independent nations faced a stark reality. They were politically free, but economically entangled in the same web that empires had spun centuries before.
Energy once again became central to geopolitical strategy. Control over oil, natural gas, and rare minerals determined not only industrial capacity, but political leverage. The 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine illustrated this starkly. Wheat exports, natural gas pipelines, and global shipping routes were suddenly tools of economic pressure, highlighting how vulnerable interconnected economies could be to conflict. Trade also intersects with finance on a global scale. Currency manipulation, interest rate adjustments, and sovereign debt all influence the flow of goods and capital. Nations may compete militarily, but they also compete economically, investing, lending, and controlling the networks through which the modern world operates. A port, a pipeline, a chip foundry, or even a satellite network can determine who profits and who is forced to follow. The modern trade system has created winners and losers on a scale unimaginable a century ago. Emerging economies like India and Brazil have gained influence, while others remain dependent on foreign capital and technology. Multinational corporations operate across borders with immense autonomy, shaping national policies and global markets. Supply chains stretch across continents so that a single disruption in one country cascades worldwide. Technology has amplified these dynamics. Advanced analytics, AI, and logistics software allow corporations and governments to track, predict, and control the movement of goods like never before. But these advantages are not evenly distributed. Nations with strategic control over key technologies, semiconductors, rare earth elements, and cloud infrastructure wield disproportionate influence over global trade. In this hyper-connected world, economic interdependence is both a stabilizer and a source of tension. It can prevent wars, because no nation wants to destroy its own markets. Yet it can also be weaponized, as seen in sanctions against Iran, North Korea, and Russia. Trade is no longer just about profit. It is about influence, coercion, and survival. And so, the geopolitics of global trade today is a story of paradoxes. Nations are more connected than ever, yet strategic rivalries are intensifying.
Cooperation and competition exist simultaneously, with the balance constantly shifting. One miscalculation, one policy change, or one disruption can reverberate across continents, affecting millions of lives. Understanding global trade is no longer a matter of economics alone. It is about power, foresight, and strategic thinking. It is about knowing not just who produces and who consumes, but who sets the rules, who benefits, and who is vulnerable. Because in the world of modern commerce, borders may be porous, but the stakes have never been higher.
The 1970s brought a seismic shock that exposed this vulnerability. When oil-producing nations in the Middle East restricted supply, prices skyrocketed. Western economies faltered. For the first time, resource-rich nations realized they could wield trade as a weapon of power. The global balance shifted, not through war, but through commodities. The term petrodollar entered the world's vocabulary, marking a new fusion of finance, energy, and politics. Then, in 1971, the foundation of the post-war system cracked. President Richard Nixon unpegged the U.S. dollar from gold, ending the Bretton Woods Agreement. The world entered the era of floating currencies. From that point on, money itself became a tradable commodity, its value fluctuating by the minute, creating new winners and losers in the volatile game of global exchange. As markets liberalized in the 1980s and 1990s, a new phase began: globalization. Corporations discovered that production could be scattered across continents. Design in California, manufacturing in China, assembly in Mexico, marketing in Europe. Trade was no longer about finished goods, it was about supply chains. The world economy had become an intricate, invisible network of transactions, data, and logistics. Globalization promised prosperity, and for many, it delivered. Millions were lifted out of poverty. Consumer goods became cheaper, and economies grew faster than ever before. But beneath that growth lay fragility. Nations became dependent on each other in ways they could no longer control. A disruption in one corner of the world could ripple through the entire system, as the world would soon discover in the 21st century. The age of interdependence had begun, an era where borders mattered less, but power still mattered most. The 21st century trade wars and economic interdependence. The 21st century opened with a promise: a fully globalized economy, where goods, services, and capital flowed with unprecedented speed and efficiency. Technology connected continents, digital markets replaced physical barriers, and multinational corporations became more powerful than some nations. But beneath the sheen of progress, the geopolitics of trade had grown more complex, more fragile, and more contested than ever before. No nation was truly self-sufficient. The world's dependence on supply chains, energy flows, and raw materials created a delicate web. A factory shutdown in one country could delay products across the globe. A port strike in another could halt critical components, from electronics to medical supplies. Trade had become both a lifeline and a vulnerability. And with vulnerability comes leverage. Nations discovered that trade could be wielded as a tool of power. Tariffs, sanctions, and export controls became weapons of diplomacy. In 2018, the United States and China entered a tit-for-tat trade war, slapping billions of dollars in tariffs on each other's goods. The ripples extended far beyond the two nations, affecting global markets, agriculture, technology, and consumer prices. It was a reminder that economic influence could be just as potent as military force.